For years, I've been told, don't play too low on the piano. Stay off the root. That's the bass player's job. But look, I'm all alone here. All my bass playing friends are at work. And so today, I'm on my own. In all seriousness, every jazz pianist needs to know how to walk a bass line so that we can play solo. And so let's take a look at this tune, The Days of Wine and Roses, and I'll give you a walking bass 101. So the job of the bass player is to provide the foundation for everything else that we play. And if we're going to be the bass player, our left hand has to cover those responsibilities. And those responsibilities are basically rhythmic and harmonic. The most important thing that the bass player does is set the foundation for the rhythm. They have to be rock solid in the pocket all the time, but they also build the foundation of the groove that everybody else is going to follow. Our bass player also has to be the foundation of the harmony. Oftentimes we think about the bass player playing the root of the chord. That's an important part of the bass player's job, but they also have to think melodically, linearly, because their job is to kind of go horizontal and figure out how to connect the root of this chord and transition us into the root of the next chord. Do you remember those connect the dots games we played as a kid, where you would draw a line from number 1 to number 2 to number 3, and by the time you got to number 56, we had drawn a picture of something? That's kind of how I think about being a bass player. We have all these dots, which are the chord tones, the roots of all the chords that we're playing, and we have to connect one chord to the next chord to the next chord in order to put the overall song together. As piano players, we often think vertically, like what are all the chord tones we want to play and how are we going to voice them? But as the bass player, we have to think horizontally. We're creating a melodic line that's going to go from one chord to the next. When it's our job as piano players to cover the bass, we need to be really careful that we play in the right register. By default, kind of our left hand tends to be in this range here in the piano, right? This is middle C, and our hand tends to be around here. But the bass notes on a double bass are actually all the way down here. So if we want to get that authentic bass sound, we need to play down here in the same register that the double bass would play. I mentioned this before, the most important thing we do is that we keep solid time. So as we're practicing our bass lines, you have to play with a metronome. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The metronome is where the rhythm lives. And as much as I would like to think that my metronome lies to me every day, the reality is my rhythm just isn't good enough. We also have to be very clear in our articulation when we play bass lines. We want each of our notes to have a pretty clear attack, and we also want a little bit of space between the notes. Think about an upright bass when you pluck them, right? The pluck has a pretty sharp attack, and the bass itself is a big instrument with a lot of resonance, so the notes ring out. You don't want to play. It just sounds weird. It doesn't sound like an authentic bass player. We also have to set up a solid swing feel. When I first started playing bass lines, I wondered, how am I supposed to swing it? It's just quarter notes. The swing all comes from the eighth note rhythm. But actually, this isn't true. A lot of our swing feel just comes from how we emphasize different beats of the measure. Specifically, beats 2 and 4 should just come out just a little bit more than 1 and 3. I'm exaggerating that a little bit to make it clear here on video, but you really should feel a little bit of emphasis on 2 and 4. To add a little bit of that eighth note swing feel, we can occasionally throw in a ghost note. I think of the ghost note as being only rhythm. You know that pattern we hear on the ride cymbal? Ding, ding, ga ding, ga ding, ga ding. Well, those guzz, that's kind of where we put the ghost notes. There's no science really to what note we pick. I would pick something that's in the harmony just so that it doesn't clash, but really this is all about rhythm. All right, so let's look here at the days of wine and roses. So let's start by walking a bass line, but in 2 instead of in 4. That means rather than playing quarter notes, we're going to play half notes. So when we look at the lead sheet, we can see exactly where the chords change because there's a chord symbol here, right? So on this beat, on beat 1, we want to make sure that we play an F, a root of the chord on that beat. Same thing here on E flat. When we get to beat 1 of this measure, we want to make sure that we play E flat, the root on beat 1. And again here on D, this is true. Now, this is not necessarily true here because we don't have an explicit chord change. It's the second bar of D7. It continues. In our 2 feel, we're going to play on beat 1 and on beat 3 of each of these measures. And at least for now, while we're getting started, whenever we see the chord change, we're going to play the root of that chord. But what do we do in the other spaces? Well, we just get to create movement. We get to pick other notes from the harmony or from the scale or something that's going to create that direction that takes us from this chord to the next chord. So for the F and the E flat, I just picked other notes of the chord to move between. But when we got to this D7, I did something a little bit more interesting. So here I played D, then F sharp, and then A. Nothing tricky here so far. These are just the notes of D major. But then I played A flat. Why did I play A flat? That doesn't belong to D7. Remember, the job of the bass player is to think horizontally. And that means we need to go from one chord to the next chord, and we need to guide the listener's ear to get there. And so right here, we have to go from D7 to G7. We got to find a way to transition, right? To move from one to the next. So here for the first part of this chord, we're firmly in D major or in D7. We're just playing notes of the chord. But we've now got to go from this A note to G, our next root, right? And so an easy way to do that is just grow chromatic. Now, I've been listening to a lot of Dave McKenna lately, and Dave McKenna is the king of the walking bass line on piano. You could make an argument for some other players who have played very well, but I think I'm ready to go to the mattresses to defend Dave McKenna as the king of the walking bass. So if we want to walk a bass line more like what Dave McKenna would play, we got to upgrade from a 2-feel to a 4-feel. He might play something kind of like this. Dave McKenna was an absolute beast, and of course, I don't sound anything like him, but that's okay, we're having fun. So as we're just getting started learning how to play bass lines, we're gonna follow the same guidelines that we did when we played in a 2-feel. That is, whenever we see the chords change on the beat, we're gonna make sure we play the root of the chord on that beat. And then everything in between those are gonna be transition notes to take us from one chord to the next. So the real difference is just that now we have 4 notes to get from one chord to the next instead of 2. So there are a few ways that we can pick our transition notes. So the simplest thing we could do would just be to double up on the notes. We could play literally the same thing we did in the 2-feel, but just play the notes twice. So here was our 2-feel. And if we double those up, don't forget to add that little bit of extra emphasis on beats 2 and 4. Another thing that we could do would be to play step motion, just following the notes of the scale that belong to this chord. Or we could use chord notes and kind of arpeggios. We can also use a chromatic scale, but the trick with the chromatic scale is to make sure we have a target we're aiming for. So when we were playing in our 2-feel, we played. We put this chromatic A flat. But now that we have 4 beats in the measure, we have a lot more opportunity to do that. We can create longer chromatic lines. But there's nothing wrong with taking leaps either. You could jump a 5th or a 6th or even a full octave. And now that we understand these different types of movements, repeating notes, arpeggios, scale lines, chromatic approaches, and even leaps, let's look at some common formulas that we would use to play over progressions that we see all the time in the standards. If you've ever wanted to learn how to improvise a solo, but you found it just too intimidating, I've put together a 7-day soloing challenge. It's completely free for you forever. Every day unlocks a new video that teaches you one very specific technique that you can put into practice, and by the end of the 7 days, you'll be able to invent a new solo over the song after you've gone, or frankly, any song that you want to. And if you're really interested to go deeper, you can jump into my Jazz Fundamentals course, which is on sale right now for the summer. I think it's like $70. We would love to have you as a member over there. All right, let's get back into the bass lines. There's a whole art and science to creating bass lines, and the great bass players like Ray Brown are certainly not thinking about formulas. But much in the same way that we practice riffs and licks when we're improvising, I think it's useful to practice some formulas for our bass line. Not because we want to be thinking about these as formulas while we're performing, but that because we've practiced them and put them into our hands, those ideas are going to become part of us and they kind of come out naturally as ideas that we can use while we're playing. So our first chord here is F, and let's just pretend we wanted to loop F endlessly. Well, we can play this formula, which is 1, 2, 3, 5. So F, G, A, C. And we can do this over absolutely any chord. So if we go to our next chord, E flat 7, we just do 1, 2, 3, 5 of E flat. Then D7, and then you can string those together. You could also play 1, 3, 5, and 6. If we have the same chord for two measures, like we do on this D7, we can actually just walk the scale straight up. In this case, it would be a D7 scale. Barry Harris taught me this idea of pivoting, which is a way to add more variety to these really simple formulas like this. So let's go back to our formula, our 1, 2, 3, 5. Well, Barry taught us that we could switch octaves in the middle. So for example, instead of playing the C on top, we put the C on the bottom. Or you could actually play the F up top. You can even do this in the middle of a scale line. We can just switch octaves somewhere in the middle. If you're going to pivot a scale like this, I find it's best to do the pivot immediately after a chord tone. So in this example over D7, I walk up to the F sharp, which is the third of D, and then I go down and continue the line from G underneath it. Pivoting kind of gives us two things that we can work with. The first one is it gives us a chance to break up the monotony of these formulas. The other thing is it gives us a way to make sure we keep our hand down here in the right area of the keyboard. Oftentimes, as we're walking from one chord to the next, our hand will migrate slowly up the keyboard to the point where we get too high for it to sound authentic. And so pivoting gives us that opportunity to bring things back down a little bit. So the 1, 2, 3, 5 and the 1, 3, 5, 6 patterns are great when you're just thinking one chord to the next chord to the next chord. And it just so happens that oftentimes they actually do create nice little transitions from one chord to the next. But let's talk about how we move around the circle of fifths, where we can put much more intentional transitions in place. So as we're going around the circle of fifths, let's say we're going from F to B flat. Well, we can just walk straight down the scale. Let's extend that a little bit. Let's go from F to B flat, and then let's go down another fifth to E flat. And we can go down another fifth from F to B flat to E flat to A flat. Uh-oh, ran out of keys. But you get the point. Whenever you're moving down a fifth, you can just walk straight down the scale. So as we go down by a fifth, it just so happens that we have exactly the right number of notes to get there. But if we want to walk the scale up from F to B flat, we actually get there too soon. We're a beat early. So what I like to do is put a flat 3 in there as well. That way we make sure we land right on the beat with our B flat. So again, we can go down, or we could come up. We could just keep moving by circle of fifths forever this way. We just keep going. You notice we're getting pretty high now, though. So it's useful to practice both up and down so that you can keep your hand parked in kind of one place as you go around the circle. So why is this so useful? Well, because so many of our chord progressions move by fifths. Look here at Days of Wine and Roses. D to G, fifth. B flat to E flat, fifth. A to D, fifth. D to G, fifth. G to C, fifth. E to A, fifth. A to D, fifth. D to G, fifth. And G to C, fifth. Look at them all. So anywhere that we see these, we can use our walk-ups or walk-downs. Take a 2-5-1 in the key of F. That's G minor to C to F. It moves around the circle of fifths. Or we could go down. Or if you extend the 2-5-1 into a turnaround, like a 6-2-5-1, same thing still works. We do go around the circle of fifths in the opposite direction too. Not quite as much, but still something you should know. So for example, that would be going from F to C. The way that I like to go up a fifth is with a formula 1, 3, 4, sharp 4, and then 5. It's kind of cliche, you've probably heard that before. If I need to go up a third, let's say from F to A7, one possible formula would be 1 to 5, and then back down to 2, sharp 2, 3. That would be F to C to G, G sharp, and then to A. That's one of those places where the chromatic line really leads you into the next chord. It's really common for us to go from 1 to 6, which is the same kind of move as 1 to 3. It's just upside down. So I basically do the same move, I just invert it. So I do 1 to 5 and then 7, flat 7, 6. So I'm coming down by chromatics instead. I have one more formula to show you, and after that you'll be able to walk a bass line over this entire tune. In fact, you'll be able to walk a bass line over almost any song in the real book. So we need to handle this situation right here, where we have E and A in a single measure, or D and G in a single measure. One really easy way to work through this is to treat this just like we're in a two feel again, right? We know we have to play an E here, we have to add a passing note here, and then an A, and then a passing note. So we have one passing note between the chords again, just like we did when we were playing half notes in a two feel. Same thing is true here for this D, passing note, G, passing note. The other technique you can do, which I hear all the time, is to approach the next chord with a half step away. So our passing notes are always going to be either a half step above the next chord or a half step below the next chord. So for us to go here from E to A, we could connect the two with a half step that is below the A, or a half step above the A. It creates a nice tension and release, and it introduces some notes from outside the diatonic scale most of the time. And then we can keep it going. We've only got 2 beats to get to the D, so we'll put in a half step, let's say above the D. And then here we are on G7, we'll do the same thing, half step above. That sound is super hip. You hear it all the time over like a turnaround in the blues, for example. Let's look really quickly at the chord moves in Days of Wine and Roses, see if we can identify what we will do on each of them, and then we'll give it a shot. So F and E flat, we can just play one of our 1, 2, 3, 5 patterns. When we get to D7, we've got 2 measures. So we can just play an arpeggio or something for the first measure, and then we need to walk up from the D to the G, right? It's around the circle of fifths. Then we can kind of camp out on G minor, maybe do one of our 1, 2, 3, 5s there also, or our 1, 3, 5, 6, either one. When we get to B flat to E flat, now we're in circle of fifths, so we can walk up or walk down. A to D, circle of fifths, D to G, G to C, those are all circle of fifths. Our C to E is our 1 to 3 move. That's going to be 1 to 5, 2, sharp 2, 3. And now we're in the sequence where there's 2 chords in every bar. So we can just use those chromatic approach notes in each of those. And then here again, we have a walk up around the circle of fifths from G to C, and then from C to F. And this is basically a repeat back to the head of the tune. Let's play it and see what it sounds like. Now, before you click off YouTube to go practice, you should watch these next 2 videos. They were handpicked just for you.